Welcome to the Sheldonian Theater. We're down to the last three venues that you'll see. So in quick succession, you'll see this. There's then the Divinity School, and then Freud's for the after party. So this theatre was finished in 1669. It's been designed by Sir Christopher Wren. It's where our university parliament meets, congregation. So it's kind of a bit confusing that we're a parliamentary democracy in this university, and that results in all sorts of weird things going on. But it meets here. It's also where degrees are conferred. So people come through, they come in their current gowns, all very Harry Potter-like, and then they leave and get changed in the divinity schools and put on their new gowns, and then they come back in a kind of a rather elaborate ceremony. But anyway, so this is where that happens. So I hope you like it. So we've got about an hour here. We're going to hear from Professor Colin Mayer, who I'll briefly introduce. He's going to speak for about half an hour, and then there's some time for Q&A. And then we've got a brief session where we award 6 paper prizes. And for a lot of today, quite a few of us have been running around conferring, trying to decide who gets the checks. You'll hear about that soon. But Colin, thank you so much for coming and giving this closing keynote. So Colin is the Peter Moores Professor of Management Studies at the Saïd Business School. In 1994, he was the first professor at the Saïd Business School and was the Dean of the Business School from 2006 to 2011. He was also the first director of the Oxford Financial Research Centre here at the university between 1998 and 2005. A very distinguished Oxford academic, and we're delighted to have him here. So over to you, Colin. Thank you.
Ben, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. But you clearly shouldn't believe everything that you hear, because as Woody Allen said, since light travels faster than sound, people appear bright until you hear them speak. I'm going to be talking to you about one of the most important institutions in our lives. It's not the state, religion, or GRASFI. It's an institution that clothes, feeds, and houses us, that employs us and invests our savings. It's the source of economic prosperity and the growth of nations around the world. But at the same time, it's been a cause of growing inequality, environmental degradation, and mistrust. Every year for the past 36 years, Ipso Mori, the market research company, has undertaken a survey of 1,000 people in Britain as to which professions they trust to tell the truth. At the top, alongside doctors, nurses, and teachers, I'm pleased to say, come university professors. We might not have much power, pay, or prestige, but at least people trust us to do nothing, earn nothing, and to get no credit for it. At the other end come business leaders, just ahead of estate agents, professional footballers, journalists, and rock bottom, yes, you've guessed it, come politicians. They come below bankers, trade union officials, and the man and woman in the street. It's been true for nearly all of the 36 years of the survey. Mistrust in business is profound, pervasive, and persistent. Why is that the case? I'd suggest to you the answer is a crude interpretation of what has come to be known as the Friedman Doctrine after Milton Friedman, who said that there is one and only one social purpose of business: to increase profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game. That's been the basis of business practice, policy, and education ever since. But it wasn't always so. Indeed, the corporation was established under Roman law some 2,000 years ago to perform a very public function of collecting taxes, minting coins, and maintaining public buildings. And for nearly all of its 2,000-year history, business has combined its commercial activities with performing public functions. It's only over the last 60 years that the idea that the only purpose of business is to make money has gained increasing traction. And that has been the cause of growing inequality, environmental degradation, and mistrust. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. Because while technology offers tremendous opportunities for enhancing our well-being, it also poses serious risks. And as technology accelerates, the lag of regulation behind business innovation increases. Artificial intelligence is an example of that. We think of the issues of artificial intelligence around the future of work. Important though that is not actually going to be the main impact of artificial intelligence going forward. Its main impact is not going to be so much on manual labor as on mental labor. Because as machine learning increases, then not only will machines be able to assist us in taking decisions, it will take decisions for us. And it won't only sit alongside directors in boardrooms, assisting them with taking boardroom decisions. It will replace directors. And that raises very fundamental questions about who is programming those algorithms and for what purpose. But things are changing. At the beginning of this year, Larry Fink, the CEO and president of BlackRock, said that every business needs to have a purpose, not a strapline or a marketing campaign, but a statement of its fundamental reason for being, what it does on a daily basis. Purpose, he said, is not the sole pursuit of profits, but the animating force for achieving them. And leaders of Vanguard and State Street have said very similar things. And last month, the Business Roundtable put forward its statement of corporate purposes, in which it said that corporate purpose is about delivering value for customers, investing in employees, dealing fairly with suppliers, supporting communities in which they work, and looking after our environment, alongside creating long-term value for shareholders. And it's not just business leaders and investors who are saying this. It's also policymakers. Britain led the world in terms of corporate governance standards when in 1992 the Cadbury Code was first established. But in July of last year, the Financial Reporting Council fundamentally altered the nature of corporate governance in this country, away from the idea that it was about solving the agency problem of aligning managerial interests with those of shareholders, to the notion that it was about aligning managerial interests with the delivery of corporate purposes. And politicians have been making similar points. President Macron in France has put raison d'etre, an intrinsic notion of purpose, at the heart of the French Civil Code, and Elizabeth Warren, the presidential candidate in the US, has, as part of her Accountable Capitalism Act, said that every company in the US with revenues in excess of $1 billion should have a charter with a public purpose associated with it. Now, all of this demonstrates the speed, the significance, and the scale of the change that is in progress around the notion of why business exists, what it's there to do, and what it aspires to become. In other words, the purpose of business. And everything should follow from that: business practice, policy, and education. The purpose of business is not to produce profits. The purpose of business is to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet. And in the process, it produces profits. But profits are not per se the purpose of business. Everyone who runs successful businesses knows that to be the case. And they don't profit from producing problems for people or planet. Instead, what they do is they commit to their corporate purposes. And they commit to those who help to create those corporate purposes. And those people, in turn, commit to helping to create those corporate purposes. And that gives rise to reciprocal relations of trust and mutual benefits, both for the parties to the firm and to the firm itself. It gives rise to more loyal customers, more engaged employees, more reliable suppliers, more supportive shareholders and societies. And that creates greater revenues, lower costs, and more profits for firms. What underpins this is the trustworthiness of business to do it. And underpinning that are the values and cultures of business, values of honesty and integrity, and cultures of commitment to those corporate purposes. Now, I want to illustrate this in relation to one particular company. It's a company that is one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world and one of the main producers of insulin. It's the Danish company Novo Nordisk. A few years ago, it recognized that it was actually failing to deliver insulin to the markets in the world where type 2 diabetes, which it treats, is most prevalent. 85% of type 2 diabetes is associated with low and middle income countries, most of whom could not afford to pay for the costs of that insulin. So what it did was it cross-subsidized the price at which it was selling insulin in developing countries from the profits that it was making in developed countries. Now that was moderately interesting, but it wasn't very profound. But what it then realized was that actually its purpose was not to produce insulin. Its purpose was to treat people who had type 2 diabetes. And so it worked with doctors, medical practitioners, hospitals, universities around the world to try and identify what were the best treatments for type 2 diabetes in different cases, which might or might not involve prescribing insulin. But then it realized actually its purpose was not to simply treat type 2 diabetes either. Its purpose was to prevent people from getting type 2 diabetes in the first place. And its clearly stated purpose is to eradicate diabetes. So then what it did was it started working with local authorities, with communities, with NGOs, with national governments, to identify the changes in lifestyles that were required to prevent people from getting type 2 diabetes. Now you might say, well, that's all very well and all very inspiring, but surely it just undermined Novo Nordisk's basic business model. But the answer is it did exactly the opposite. Because, of course, what it did in the process of engaging with these various parties was it became a trusted supplier and a trusted advisor. And so it became an advisor for all manners of medical problems and supplies of products. And it's flourished on the back of that. Now, the question that this really raises in terms of the notion of purpose of businesses, their trustworthiness, their enabling cultures and values, is how can you really bring about this transformation? There's a program of research going on at the British Academy called The Future of the Corporation, which is trying to identify the policies that are required to establish this reconceptualization of business. And it's identified 4 sets of policies. The first is around law and regulation. Corporate law at the moment is viewed as being about the rights of shareholders and the fiduciary responsibilities of directors of companies to uphold the interests of shareholders. But that's not what it should be solely or primarily about. It should be about the duties of directors to state their corporate purposes and demonstrate that they have the ownership, governance, and measurement systems to deliver on those corporate purposes. Regulation is viewed as being about the rules of the game and the enforcement of those rules. But that's not what it should be about either. It should also be about aligning the private purposes and interests of companies with the social and public purposes of companies that perform important public functions. For example, the commanding heights of the economies, as they're sometimes termed, utilities, banks, auditing companies, infrastructure providers, public service providers. Those companies perform essential public roles, and their purposes should be aligned with their social licenses to operate. The second set of policies relate to ownership and governance. Ownership at the moment is viewed as being about the rights of shareholders. But it shouldn't just be about the rights of shareholders, it should be about the duties and obligations of shareholders to promote those corporate purposes and uphold them. And we should seek a variety of forms of ownership to promote plurality in corporate purposes. Ownership that can span from family ownership, foundation ownership, employee state ownership, to mutual funds, hedge funds, pension funds, etc. And aligned with that should be the governance, the corporate governance of companies. As I said just now, that is not predominantly about solving the agency problem. It's about aligning managerial interests with the delivery of corporate purposes. And that Financial Reporting Council set out as its principles for corporate governance in the UK that the board of directors of companies should establish their purposes, their values, and their strategies, and ensure that they are aligned with each other and with the culture of companies. Directors should act with integrity, lead by example, and promote the desired cultures. And then Principle 3 says that the board of directors should ensure that the company has the resources that are required to meet its objectives and measure its performance by them. That sums up very well what is required to achieve a focus of companies and a credibility of companies in delivering on their purposes. They should state their purposes, they should demonstrate how their values, their culture, their strategy, their allocation of resources and investments, and the measurement of their performance is aligned with delivering on those purposes. And that comes on to the third set of issues and policies: measurement and performance. Measurement at the moment is done in relation to material capital and financial capital. But increasingly we're coming to realize the importance of other forms of assets for companies and the dependency of those other forms of assets on companies. Human assets, natural assets, and social assets. And one should measure performance in relation to those. We first of all need to have a set of some standard metrics, a small number of standard metrics that apply across all companies, that can be used by investors in comparing the performance of companies in regard to those assets across companies. And then we need to have some specific metrics that are related to the particular purposes of companies. And performance at the moment we measure in terms of profits. Profits net of the depreciation of the material capital of companies. But we should be measuring performance in terms of the delivery of firms in relation to their purposes. And we should measure the profits of the companies net, not just of the maintenance of physical capital, but also of human assets, social assets, and natural assets. And companies should provide for the costs of remedying the failures to fulfill their purposes. That gives you a true, not a fake measure of profit. And the final set of policies relate to finance and investment. Finance is predominantly thought of in relation to the interests of savers and investors. And much regulation and minority investor protection is focused on the interest of investors. But that has frequently come at the cost of the element that is equally crucial in the operation of financial markets, and that is the engagement of investors with companies. Companies need to build up relationships of the provision of risk capital over the long term to be able to invest for their purposes. To the extent that regulation has given rise to the sorts of ownership patterns that we observe, in particular in the United States and the UK, of very dispersed ownership systems, that undermines the ability of companies to build up relations with their investors. You cannot have a relationship with the anonymous. And it's not just relationships between providers of finance and users of finance in private capital markets that matters. It's also about relationships between companies and the public sector with governments. Private financial initiatives, public-private partnerships have been lamentably unsuccessful over the last few decades. And that's because of a lack of trust between the two parties, because of a divergence of interest between what governments are interested in terms of promoting the public interest and what companies are interested in, and that is just making money for their shareholders and executives. So we fundamentally need to reconsider the notions of how we structure our laws, regulations, ownership, governance, measurements, performance, finance, and investment, so that those are aligned with the notions of what the purposes of business are and aspire to become, and the demonstration of a commitment to a delivery on those purposes. Now, I want to illustrate this with a second example that comes from one of the most unsuccessful industries over the last decade or so, the banking industry. And I want to relate it to one of the most successful banks in Europe, at least, if not the world, over the last decade or so. It's a bank that has enjoyed increasing returns for its shareholders from before the financial crisis, during the financial crisis, and after the financial crisis. It needed no bailing out during the financial crisis. It has one of the highest credit ratings of any bank in Europe, one of the highest solvency ratios, one of the highest liquidity ratios. It has a clear purpose in terms of putting the interest of its customers first, and also being one of the lowest cost providers of any of its competitors. And for the past 44 years, it has succeeded on both counts. It has one of the highest levels of customer satisfaction of any of its rivals, and it's also got one of the most loyal customers. And that comes back to one of the points that I was making just now about reciprocity. Look after your customers, and your customers look after you. It's one of the fastest growing banks in Britain. But it's not a British bank. It's the Swedish bank Handelsbanken. Now, one of the very interesting features of that bank is the way in which it structures its governance arrangement. In most banks, and in particular since the financial crisis as a consequence of regulatory principles, banks are very much hierarchical organizations run from the top with centralized control of much of the decision-taking that goes on in the bank. The principle of Handelsbanken is very different. It's exactly the opposite. It is to decentralize decision-taking down to the individual branches. And the mantra of the bank is the branch is the bank, to the point that the branch managers have discretion over which customers they service, what products they sell them, how they market to them, how they price them, whether or not they decide to lend to them. And that's what allows the bank to build up close relationships with its customers. And that's the basis of that loyalty and therefore on the financial stability of the bank. But what underpins that is not just a notion of a humane treatment of customers, but a humane treatment of employees. So one of the features of this bank is that it doesn't pay its employees any bonuses. Now just think about how we are repeatedly told that banks have to pay their employees bonuses because otherwise they can't recruit or retain their staff. Well, this bank doesn't, at least until the age of 60, at which stage they get a share in a fund called Octogonen based on the profits of the business. It's a very long-term incentive scheme. Now, what underpins that is the notion that actually what gives rise to a better performance of employees is not so much to incentivize them in a financial sense, but to place a lot of emphasis in terms of how you recruit people, in particular to become branch managers, and then how you instill the values of the bank in them. But then you leave it up to them to make decisions and run their branches, and you don't try and impose oversight and financial incentives on them in doing that. And that relates to a third interesting feature of this bank, and that is its ownership. It's listed on the Swedish stock markets, it's widely traded, but it has two dominant shareholders, one of which is Octogonen, the profit-sharing scheme, and the other is Industrivarden, the Swedish holding company. And if you pose the question, well, who is the largest shareholder in Industrivarden? You've guessed it. It's Handelsbanken. It's a cross-shareholding. It's what most textbooks would describe as being the worst form of corporate governance, self-ownership, essentially, of the bank. And yet, it's associated with one of the most successful banks over an extended period of time. Now, I emphasize this not only because I think it's important in terms of the subject of this conference of sustainable finance, and not simply because it's important in terms of one of the most important institutions in our lives, namely business, but because I think it's important for the nature of our capitalist system. The way in which we conventionally view capitalism is an economic system of private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. And ownership in this context is viewed as being a bundle of rights over the ownership of those assets that confers strong forms of authority and control over the possessors of those assets. And firms in this context are viewed as nexuses of contracts which are upheld by the board of directors for the benefit of their owners. Now that's a coherent, consistent concept of capitalism, that it's about private ownership for profit by owners who exercise strong forms of authority over us through contracts. But there's an alternative view of capitalism, and that is that it's about providing profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet by public and private owners who do not profit from producing problems for people or planet. And ownership in this context is not just a bundle of rights, but a set of obligations and responsibilities on those owners to uphold those corporate purposes. And firms are not just nexuses of contracts, but nexuses of relations of trust enshrined by the boards of directors in the principles and values of those businesses. Now that, too, is a coherent, consistent notion of capitalism which says it's about solving problems by owners and directors of companies who engage the rest of us through relations of trust as well as contracts. Now, what underpins the traditional view of capitalism is competition. Competition in product markets, in labor markets, in financial markets. And where competition fails, regulation moves in. But what this alternative view suggests is that between market efficiency and regulatory effectiveness, there is a void which is increasingly becoming a chasm as technology accelerates, where both markets fail and regulation and governments fail. And in that void, we rely on business to transform our individual self-interests into collective cooperative interests in a common purpose. Because what really motivates us as individuals is not simply the notions of financial returns, but the notion of doing things that inspire us, that give us a sense of real meaning and fulfillment in our work, a notion of pride and dignity. In other words, that contribute to our own individual purposes. And underpinning that is the trustworthiness of business to do it. Because trust is one of the most important and yet unrecognized assets of business. And trustworthy corporations are commercially successful corporations. And the competitiveness of nations depends on the trustworthiness of our corporations. For the prosperity of the many, not just the few, for the future as well as the present. Thank you very much.
Fantastic speech. Thank you so much for that. We've got time for questions. We have some roving mics. Could you say your name and affiliation before you ask the question? Who wants to go first?
I'm Richard Levitch from New York University. Enjoyed your speech very much. Imagine a thought experiment where we have two firms that are alike in most respects, and one of them follows traditional capitalism as you described it, and the other one follows this new vision of capitalism as you describe it, where a company has a purpose and invests in employees and so forth. If you put them in free competition, do you have a feeling of which one would win out, or would they coexist, or how might it turn out?
Yes, Richard, I think I can tell you which I think would win, all right? And it would be the second. It would be the reconceptualized notion of business. Now, let me tell you why you're posing that question and why people think it might be otherwise. What underpins that idea is, well, if you've got two companies, one of which is, quote, purpose-driven and the other is shareholder primacy-driven, then capital will clearly flow from the purpose-driven company to the shareholder primacy company. But that is precisely what won't happen. And the reason it won't happen is that, come back to the observation that I made, that companies need to have owners who create and state the corporate purpose, and they start off as being the founders of companies, and then they become the parties that purchase blocks of shares in companies. And those companies then get listed on stock markets. Okay, what price do they get listed on the stock market? The price they get listed on the stock market is the price that reflects the expected future returns to those shareholders. Okay, so the cost of pursuing a purpose is borne by those who promote that purpose. Outside investors, of course, earn a normal return, and they earn exactly the same return as they would earn in a shareholder primacy company. But furthermore, this notion of there being a party that upholds the purpose creates a commercial advantage for those companies for exactly the reasons that I was explaining. Namely, that those companies have mechanisms of creating relations of trust with parties that go beyond the pure contractual arrangements that any firm can sign, be they shareholder primacy or purpose-driven companies. So there's an additional asset that those purpose-driven companies create that is not a feature of other companies, and that creates greater value to those companies that get reflected in the longer-term performance of those firms.
No, Falco Petzold, University of Zurich. Thank you very much for this fantastic talk. Inertia and distraction, I think today are very important barriers for those truths, essentially. I think that you are conferring to us being actually accepted by not necessarily even a majority of people, but at least a significant group of people that could actually make this change become reality. What would you recommend, obviously people like us who are actively engaging in bringing sustainability into the reality, what are the levers that we should focus on to overcome this inertia and this distraction, which takes, the energy away from so many other people who could affect positive change but decide not to?
Well, let me just say that I think that inertia is moving at a remarkably fast speed. It's, over the last few months, transformed itself in an incredible way. I made reference to the Business Roundtable statement by 181 CEOs of the largest corporations in the United States. And the reason why people were quite taken by that was it was 181 companies that were predominantly in the United States. Okay, we know that many businesses in other parts of the world believe that they can prosper through following alternative paths, but the fact that this was a statement by predominantly US-based corporations, which tend to be pretty cynical about this subject, was really a very significant moment. Now, many people say, was that a real statement of change? It was a very important statement in the sense that the 1997 statement by the Business Roundtable was a defining moment in terms of the Business Roundtable embedding the notion of shareholder primacy. In 1997, the Business Roundtable was actually very late at coming to the game in terms of suggesting shareholder primacy, which started, as I say, back in the 1960s and 1970s. As it so happens, the Business Roundtable is, if anything, leading the pack now in terms of suggesting that the purpose of business is not simply about promoting shareholder interests. And I've made reference to the change in attitude that's gone on amongst some of the leaders of the largest institutional investors, and you'll have been talking a great deal during this conference about the growing importance that's attached by institutional investors to a variety of measures in ESG and things like that. Now, what is really accelerating that change and what is going to accelerate that change more is you. I mean, it's the next generation. It's not the current business leaders who are really pushing for this change. It's the people who are going to take over the ownership of family businesses in the future, who are going to become the CEOs, who are much more inclined and dedicated to make this happen because it's their future. So there is a really important force at work in terms of bringing this about. There are very significant issues that need to be addressed. Probably the most serious is measurement. It's not that we're short of measures, it's exactly the opposite. There's been a proliferation of a huge number of measures of alternative forms of assets. But what is a real problem from the point of view of companies is the lack of standardization, the fact that most of this is self-reporting, much of it imposes lots of costs onto companies, and people don't know, including investors, don't know really what to make of a lot of this. So making headway in terms of measurement is a really important issue. We're basically in a 1929 or a 1930 position where people realize there's a crisis and that we're not measuring things correctly or we're not measuring them in a credible fashion. So we're in a process of moving to a position of where there's going to be much more standardization, much more verification, auditing, etc., of that data going forward. But at the moment, that is sorely lacking. So that is one area where we're going to see a lot of advancement made over the coming years.
Thank you very much. Svetlana Gross from the Stockholm School of Economics. My question is related exactly to the measurement. There are currently maybe two largest strands in terms of standardization. The one is integrating the non-financial information into the accounting system, and the other one is more developing the actual non-financial information and sort of descriptive relations to value and purpose. What is your conviction or intuition about the best way forward to promote this other type of capitalism? Thank you.
Okay, so what I talked about when I described the levers in this area were of two natures. One was in relation to measurement, and that measurement was essentially about the metrics, okay? The metrics that can be used in terms of evaluating the extent to which companies are abiding by their purposes and what can legitimately be expected by society of what companies and investors should be doing. Now, that's the area where I'm saying that we need to have two types of measures, one of which are a relatively small number of measures probably derived from the Sustainable Development Goals that essentially provide a degree of standardization of the way in which companies are measured in those regards across companies and allows investors to make those sorts of comparisons. And the second set are what I described as being more firm-specific that are related to the specific purposes of companies, where companies should derive their own measures that reflect their specific purposes. So that's what relates to measures. But in terms of actually delivering on those purposes and fulfilling those measures, then companies have to expend resources in doing that. They have to invest in their human, social, natural assets. And so the other element then is to say, well, how do we measure the performance of those investments? And so what one needs to do is to think about how does one deliver, how does one create these measures from the point of view of the questions you're trying to answer. One of the reasons why there has been this terrible proliferation of measures is that people sort of design measures that they think are rather nice measures, look good, but they don't start from the point of saying, well, what are the questions that those measures are supposed to be answering? And essentially there are, if you like, three main types of questions that should be answered. How should investors evaluate performance and allocate their resources? How should board of directors formulate strategy and decide on how to allocate investment resources? And how does one evaluate performance within a company and incentivize people within a company against those measures? And once you think in those terms, then you begin to realize that actually what you should be doing is to look at the expenditures that are being made and then the performance against those objectives that underlie those investments. It's no different from any traditional way of thinking about investments. It's just that it relates to a broader set of assets. And then you evaluate profit, as I was saying, against the extent to which you've delivered on that, and you correct for the costs associated with the failures to meet and deliver on those purposes.
Time for two quick questions. I'm going to prioritize PhD students and academics. Sorry, Mike. Over there, thank you.
Javier Solana, University of Glasgow. I would like to go back to the thought experiment that was presented in the first question. If we have two firms, one a profit-driven and another one a purpose-driven, competing, and the second one winning that competition, why haven't we seen more purpose-driven companies succeeding?
It's exactly the same answer as one would give to the observation that companies that invest in R&D and innovate a lot are often the most successful companies. The answer to your question is that this is not the way in which business has conventionally viewed itself. It has been brought up on a paradigm which suggests that there's a very different way in which business should be done. And therefore, the mindset of people who run businesses is not focused on this notion of how one should essentially create purposeful businesses and what is required in creating successful, purposeful businesses. And I'm as much to blame for this as many of the other people in this room. I helped to create a business school that has moved somewhat more in the direction of this notion of thinking about purpose as intrinsic to business, but it still is teaching a fairly conventional view of what business is about. And nearly every business school course starts from a statement along the lines of the purpose of business is to create shareholder value, and everything, accounting, finance, operations, management, etc., follows from that. And that's not the way in which we should be structuring our courses. We should be structuring our courses by starting by posing the question, what is the purpose of business? What are the different purposes of business that businesses should be following? And then think about how all those other components follow from that. So it's partly a mindset issue, but it's also that this, as I gave the analogy with innovations, this is a form of innovation. You have to think constructively about how do you solve the problems that we've got as customers and employees and communities and the environment, etc. And how does one do that in a way that isn't just philanthropy, but is commercially viable, that delivers a profit? And that's not straightforward. That needs exactly the same sorts of innovations, or managerial innovations, not necessarily technological innovations, to solve those problems. And it took Novo Nordisk quite a long period of time to come around to the realization as to what its real purpose was, namely in terms of eliminating diabetes and preventing people getting diabetes. And then it needed to think about, well, what are the partnerships it had to build up? And those were quite unconventional partnerships for most pharmaceutical companies.
Thank you, Ben. Mike Wilkins from S&P Global Ratings. Last Tuesday, our CEO and President Doug Peterson, President of S&P Global, our parent company, sent round an email to all staff at S&P Global, said that he had signed the statement from the Business Roundtable establishing S&P Global as a purpose-driven company, or committing to that anyway, which was great, but nobody has spoken to me about it, nobody's mentioned it, and I'm just wondering what your views are about how you can engage internally within a corporation which actually purposefully decides to commit itself to this path.
Well, that comes to the point that I was making about the accountability of companies to the various parties that are impacted by the notion of purpose. And accountability at the moment, as we realize, is sorely lacking in many organizations. We view it in the context of the accountability of boards of directors to their shareholders. And we know how deficient, for the most part, that oversight by financial markets has been. So one element is, well, can one strengthen that degree of accountability? But that is not what I'm advocating as being the solution to this issue. It's a question about accountability not just to shareholders. Shareholders are an important component in terms of the delivery of corporate purpose, but they are one component in the delivery of corporate purpose. And what that Business Roundtable statement recognized as one of the key elements, number 2 in the list, was investing in its employees and the importance of employees in the delivery of corporate purpose is clearly overwhelming. So that the notion of thinking about how does one create more of a sense of accountability and engagement with employees is critically important. And what you've just said is illustrative of exactly that point, and that is that if the employees of an organization that is committed to a corporate purpose is not aware of that or not aware of the implications of that, there is an element of communication and discussion that needs to go on in that organization to make it at least appear to be a reality from the point of view of the employees.